All right, we're back with On the Ball, the podcast from Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. Really excited to have Ethan Scheiner with us, joining us from California, where he's a professor of political science at UC Davis. Ethan, I think your son was actually the first person that I ever talked to, but it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, first of all, I mean, I feel very confident that this is all you realizing that your whole career has been a result of being on my teenage son's podcast, and that this is just, you felt like you owed him something, so you decided to have
Yeah,
me on to thank him.
that's right.
So I appreciate this to my son, I guess, is the thing. No, Andrew, thank you so much for having me. I've watched all of these videos. They're fantastic. I'm a huge fan of yours. And you wrote the most spectacular words for the back of my book. So I am so grateful. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. No, yeah, this is just a payback for Casey, who will all be following someday soon. And then it was your daughter that had Mr. Glasser.
That's right.
Another
That's right.
connection.
Exactly.
So I wrote a book about Glenn Burke, the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. Turns out the biggest Glenn Burke expert in the world was your daughter's middle school teacher.
Exactly. No, the coincidences have been really wild. And
Yeah.
then we realized today, of course, that we go to the same barber. So
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
It's all full circle.
Yeah, it's total mirror image here. Well, I was really it wasn't hard to write those words, the blurb for your book. It's a fantastic book, and that's what we're here to talk about. Freedom to Win. I want to make sure I get the subtitle. A Cold War story of the courageous hockey team that fought the Soviets for the soul of its people and gold medal, Olympic gold. Congratulations on the book. Just reading the various reviews and excerpts and articles and seeing how busy you've been promoting the book, it seems like it's had a fantastic response so far. Do you agree?
It's been a thrill. I mean, this is so I mean, most of in my previous life, which existed until just a year or so ago, I was just writing nerdy things. And, I wrote books, but they were for a nerdy audience that, very technical political science terms and all that. And so I really didn't know what to expect from this. It was a very different style of writing, but also I'm not used to whether there's an audience out there for anything I've written. So it's been a thrill. It's been amazing having people read it and give me feedback. And that's been something I just couldn't have expected.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was talking to a communications professor here at Vanderbilt who has an interest in soccer, and he wrote an article for The Conversation, which I know is popular in academic circles.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And he said that in writing about sports, for that site and for other more mainstream publications, it's been interesting for him to kind of be out there in a different world, and to be getting feedback from sports fans or people who are not in academia, and that he's really enjoyed it. He wasn't sure what to expect, but that was invigorating for him in a way to realize that his scholarship extended even beyond the classroom. And I know there's faculty members from different schools that watch this show, I think. But can you talk about what that experience has been like for you, and how maybe it was different than what you expected?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that at least I get very used to in my field of political science is a lot of what we do it really is technical in the sense of we're about trying to prove things. We test a lot of hypotheses. And in a way, I mean, I really believe in the mission of it all. We're trying to figure out truth in terms of the way the political world works. But it's kind of, at times, I feel really soulless. And I feel like it doesn't have real human beings and all of that. And actually, I kind of this book actually came about because I was teaching a class on politics and sports, and it was kind of a neat thing there where I was having difficulty finding material for the class that led me to this story. And I came across this story, one night in the middle of the night as I was freaking out over I couldn't figure out what to write about, what to teach about.
Yeah.
And and then I quickly found that there was almost no information on this story. But what instantly gripped me about this story was it was all about human beings and real people and heart and soul. And that was something I really wasn't used to. And I think most academics aren't quite used to. And so with this story, partly it was just me trying to get at emotions and inspiration. That's actually one of the biggest parts of this. And that's certainly absent from a lot of the work I do. And that's been the part that's been most thrilling for me, is people talking about feeling inspiration at this. And, that becomes especially important, with this. One of the things I talk a bunch about are the parallels between this story and what's going on in Ukraine today. And, right as I was finishing the book, a Ukrainian publisher reached out to me to see about trying to translate the book. And at the time, my immediate reaction was, oh my gosh, it's amazing that life is continuing on there.
Yeah.
But also a really big thing that jumped out to me was, back to the inspiration thing, that when you are suffering, when you're going through really hard times, you are desperate to find anything to inspire you. And that was the thing that's really resonated, at least what people have told me has resonated with them, is this notion of inspiration. And so that's completely different from anything I've done before.
Yeah, what a cool feeling. So is it being translated?
I don't know about that yet.
Okay.
I think I think that's still being investigated.
Yeah.
But it's pretty cool. It's definitely being translated into Czech and Slovak. That's a done deal.
Yeah.
I don't know about off in Ukraine yet.
Oh, wow. I hope so. That what an
Yeah, me
amazing thing that would be. All right. So for those who are not familiar with the story, and you said that, like, for you, the inspiration for this book came when you were doing some research for your class. So I take it you weren't necessarily an expert on this story before that, but like, what did you stumble upon when you were doing that research that was so interesting to you?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, just to go back a couple more steps. So, I mean, my previous life, I mean, I was a Japan expert. And so my first book is all about party politics in Japan. I interviewed Japanese prime ministers, all that kind of thing. So, but for fun, I sit there and say, oh, well, I know a lot about sports. Why don't I teach a class on politics and sports? And quickly realized I didn't know what the heck I was doing. But so what I was trying to find ways in which politics and sports overlapped with the Cold War. And so, the Miracle on Ice jumps out as the obvious one, the 1980 US beating the Soviet Union and the Olympics and hockey. But I just wanted other examples where people, in some way or another, the Cold War was blending into the sports. And so one night I came across a really good book by a guy named Tal Pinchevsky. He was an ESPN hockey writer, and he's still doing various things with hockey. And he had written a book on hockey defectors from the Eastern Bloc to North America. And it was, I mean, the opening of the book was incredible. And so the opening of the book was, in 1968, you have this little country of Czechoslovakia. It's a country that's communist, but has been, was opening up, becoming much more free. And then abruptly, the Soviets said, we don't want you to become, we're afraid you're moving away from us. And so the Soviets sent in 500,000 troops and thousands of tanks. And so you have this country of Czechoslovakia that, the people can't fight back against that. And so they sit there and say, well, what can we possibly do? Well, the one thing they could do was actually take on the Soviets in the 1969 World Ice Hockey Championships. And it was really remarkable that the entire country, I mean, so I spoke, in the end, I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but I ultimately spoke to a lot of players from that team. But what the people around Czechoslovakia told the players was, look, we can't do anything else. Only you can do something for us. And we don't care how else you do in these world championships, but just beat the Russians, which is what they called the Soviets. So I read this in this book and I say, oh my gosh, this is incredible. And it talks a little bit about how intense these matches are. And I say, okay, great, I'm going to teach my class this. Well, Tal's book, the Pinchevsky book, is really good, but this story covers the first 8 pages of the book, and that's it as far as that story. And I'm sitting there going, this is incredible. This is exactly a story of politics and sports overlapping, sports providing inspiration to an entire people. And I couldn't find anything else on it in English. So that's the backstory here, and that was the inspiration for me.
Yeah. Okay. And so you came into this a different part of the world than you normally are studying. Are you a hockey person, or was that
I'm
part of
not even.
painting?
I shouldn't even admit this out loud. You know, I'm. So I grew up in California. I'm sort of a classic California sports fan. Like, you know, as a kid, I was a big baseball, basketball, football guy.
Me too.
Hockey was, you know, we didn't, when I was growing up, there was no hockey team in Northern California. So I didn't even have that. And so, no, this was the hockey thing, that all came about because of this story.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I think fresh eyes on all of it
Yeah,
is a
very
good
much,
thing.
very much.
All right. So, well, the Soviets had taken over Czechoslovakia about 20 years before this takes place. Is that right? At the end of after World War II, and
Yeah.
what was life like in Czechoslovakia during those decades?
So essentially, the Soviets liberated Czechoslovakia from the Germans at the end of World War II. And so people in Czechoslovakia were very grateful to the Soviets at that point. Very quickly, though, the Soviets forced, basically threatened the country to accept communist leaders, and then made the communist leaders engage in a horribly oppressive, repressive regime where initially they were the leaders of the country were making up stories about various people in the country, and then basically coming up with false charges where claiming that people were traitors and then putting them to death. And, you know, quite a few people were put to death in the early years, you know, either, you know, because they were considered a threat or just to scare the people into submission. So there were a lot of these horrible political show trials. People weren't allowed to leave the country at all. And you could be imprisoned. Actually, many people were imprisoned simply for saying anything negative about the regime. And one of the big things the government did, which is really relevant for my story, is the government took away private property. And so, in fact, the central characters in my story, it's a family called the Holiks, and they had their whole life was their butcher shop, and the government had taken away their butcher shop. And so that was the world that existed from the late 1940s, early 1950s into the 1960s. So it was an incredibly oppressive regime.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned, well, for a brief period, things were starting to open up a little bit. How did that come about?
So in 1968, a new person took power in Czechoslovakia. His name was Alexander Dubček. He was a communist. He believed very strongly in communism. He thought it was a better way of living, that it was a way of, creating equality and making it so people didn't have to suffer. And his idea was, look, we've reached a new stage here. We don't have to be oppressive anymore. We can still believe in communists and have communist principles, but we can give people free speech and we can let them move around freely, and we can actually be honest with them. There've been tons of propaganda in the country, and he starts allowing people to speak, to actually say what the government's actually doing. And people were thrilled. People in Czechoslovakia were so happy, and they were very supportive of continuing as communists.
Mm-hmm. And then we're taping this on August 21st, which is an important date in the history of this story. So what happens in August of 1968, and how's that
So
been in this story?
the morning of August 21st, 1968, the people of Czechoslovakia, and this is a small country. I mean, they were about 14 or so million people total, but these 14 or so million people woke up in Czechoslovakia the morning of August 21st, 1968, and there were thousands of tanks in their streets. There were 500,000 troops ultimately in their streets. And it was the Soviet Union and pushing some of the other communist countries to just come in and take over and stop all this freedom nonsense. And at first, the people of Czechoslovakia tried to sort of fight back very peacefully, meaning they confronted the soldiers in the streets. But in the end, there was just nothing they could do against all this firepower.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's in August, and then looking ahead to the next spring, the World Hockey Championships are coming up, and were they supposed to be in Czechoslovakia?
Yeah, this is one of the things about this book. You know, periodically I question reality and worry that we're all living in a simulation. You know,
Right.
I mean, the number of coincidences and things in this story, I sort of feel like somebody's messing with me, where they're like, we're going to make this really easy for you. Here's another cool part. So yeah, the World Championships in 1969 were supposed to be in Prague. And after the Soviet invasion, the communist leaders worried that the people of Czechoslovakia were just going to be too out of control, that during the matches against the Soviets, they were going to be too unruly. So they said, we can't do this. And so the World Championships, which were held at the end of March, got moved up to Stockholm, Sweden.
Okay. And so you have, from a hockey perspective, I imagine the Soviet team, just like in 1980, was this formidable force that was extremely tough to beat. Like, how would you, for those of us who aren't familiar with the history of Czech hockey, like when we think of the Miracle on Ice in 1980, oh, what an upset, was it the same type of situation heading into that tournament?
So I mean, it's kind of complicated in the sense that 1980 really was actually miraculous in that the Soviets were clearly the greatest hockey team in the world, and the United States was truly putting forward some college students who, were not the best players in the United States. It was still pretty stunning what we're looking at in 1969. So Czechoslovakia, I mean, this is another part of the story that's wild. Czechoslovakia had actually been the best European team in hockey in the 1940s. And one of the terrifying things that the government did very early on, and so the Czechoslovakia won 2 world ice hockey championships in the 40s. And then in 1950, the government claimed that the national hockey team was planning to defect. And so they arrested the entire team and ultimately sentenced a large number of them to prison, including 2 people they sentenced to 15 years in the uranium mines. So that kind of killed hockey in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
It was hard to be a good team after that.
Were they just looking to eliminate a rival at that point, or?
Well, that's the thing. So you laugh, right? But in Czechoslovakia, people thought that's what was going on, because right as the Czechoslovak team was getting imprisoned, the Soviet team starts getting good. They refused to play international anything really until the 50s, because the Soviets didn't want to play in international sports unless they were sure to be good, because otherwise it'd be bad propaganda. And so people in Czechoslovakia sat there going, okay, look, the Soviets made our government imprison us because the Soviets wanted to jump over us. And I mean, it was wild. I spoke to people in Czechoslovakia who told me, like, with full confidence, oh yeah, we weren't allowed to beat the Soviets. That was a thing people believed. So by the 1960s, Czechoslovakia, though, had rebuilt its team. It was getting quite a bit better, but this was nothing compared to the Soviets. I mean, Czechoslovakia was the clear, 2nd, 3rd, 4th best team in international hockey. The Soviets had, by 1963, had put together this astonishing team. And so beginning in 1963, they won every world championships leading up to 1969 and every Olympics. So by 1969, Czechoslovakia had beaten the Soviets once in major play. That was 1961. And the Soviets had won 6 straight world championships. And this Soviet team also, in a couple of years, so in the early 1970s, would play the greatest Canadian NHL players to a standstill. So the Soviets were great. And so this wasn't quite, the college players playing the Soviets in 1980, but the Soviets were a lot better than the Czechoslovaks.
Okay. And so the way the tournament was to be structured, was there a guarantee that the Czechs they knew they were going to get to play them? And what was the conversation and just the feeling of opportunity, I guess, before when they're on their way to this tournament?
Yeah, so the tournament was kind of different from what we have today. There was no medal round or anything like that. It was just a round robin. Every team plays every other team twice. So Czechoslovakia knew it was going to play the Soviets twice. That was all set up. And, people basically knew the dates in advance. And I mean, it's really wild reading and hearing people talk about the lead up, even while the players were still in Czechoslovakia, they would go to big events and like big meet and greet events for the team. And the whole crowd would be chanting in unison things like, it's okay if you come in 5th place, just beat the Russians, just beat the Russians. And the players were sitting there. I mean, at one point, the players actually considered not playing the games really. They planned to get on the ice and just start fighting the Soviets. And they were Czechoslovakia was kind of ahead of the world in something, which was they had a team psychologist who kind of talked to them and said, wouldn't it be more fruitful to, you know, play the games and defeat them that way? And so the players were thinking about that. But more than that, it was the people in Czechoslovakia saying, you just have to beat them, that this is our only way of fighting back. And that really inspired the players to really sit there and be focused on the ice.
Yeah. And one of the great things of the book is, and like you said earlier, just the human soul to the story, you know, but you mentioned earlier the family that had their business taken away. And so how do they figure into this hockey tournament?
Oh, this family is incredible. Okay, so it goes back. There was a young man who opened a butcher shop. This is a young man by the name of Holik who opened a butcher shop during World War II under Nazi occupation. And he had 2 boys, his older son, Yaroslav, and the younger son, Yuji. And in around 1950, the communists took away the butcher shop. And up till that point, the boys had been expected to work in the butcher shop, do a lot of work. And, this is something where, they were allowed to go and have free time and play and all that. But they were going to be spending quite a few hours a week, helping the family business. Once the communists took that away from the family, the butcher father said, okay, well, I'm not going to have my kids come to work with me anymore. There's no point to that. So I'm going to make my kids athletic stars. And he had decided they were going to be stars. And, after a little bit, he realized he wanted his kids to be ski jumpers, and that didn't go very well. As the kids are crying on the ramp. But he says, okay, Czechoslovakia, we're really good at hockey. So I want my boys to become hockey players. And these 2 boys, Yaroslav and Yuji, grow up. They are superstars around the country. They come from a little town, but they still become famous all over the country. And they become 2 of the stars for this national hockey team.
Sorry, I had my mute. You never know what's going to go on in this office here. A little hubbub next door. All right. And so now we're at the tournament. And I understand that you initially had a different title for the book that relates to some of the signs that were there at the tournament. So were Czech fans, some were able to travel for the tournament. Is that right?
Yeah, some Czechs and Slovaks had been able to travel to the tournament. So in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, there was basically a lot of cracking down on countries is done through a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies are notoriously slow. And so Czechoslovakia was a little slow in figuring out how hard to crack down on the country. And so as of March 1969, which was 7 months after the invasion, there was still some travel. Alexander Dubček, the new leader, had allowed just free travel. So people were still to some degree able to travel, especially up to a place like Sweden. And so the players come out from the locker room where, they are so fired up, ready to go. And they are talking about this as, the most important thing they would ever do in their lives. And they're looking around the stadium, and it's a mostly Swedish crowd still. And Swedes are actually bringing in Czechoslovak flags and having, things written in Czech and are prepared to chant in Czech. But there was a young man he was from Czechoslovakia, and he brought a sign that he held up in the stands that said, "You send tanks, we bring goals." So meaning, you, Soviet Union, you may be so tough when you've got all the firepower, but on a level playing field, let us show you what we can do here. And we're going to fight back using sports here.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
As we continue with the story, how did you do the research for this book? Did you have a researcher over there doing interviews for you? Did you go and have a translator, or like, I'm just curious about that aspect.
All of the above. This was really exciting. So it started off with I said the Holik family. And so Yaroslav Holik, the older brother, he was the heart and soul of the family. He was an absolute wild man. I've read about very few people like him in all of, I mean, not even just sports, just as a human being. He was a wild person. And I hope we can talk a little bit more about him later, because I just love stories about him. But I mean, he fought everybody. Big, short takeaway is he just got into fights all the time. Well, one of the things he decided later on, when he worried about the world of Czechoslovakia and how tough it was to be a regular person, he knew that athletes in communist countries had a really good life relative to regular people.
Mm-hmm.
But he saw what could happen potentially to his kids, and he really worried about them. So he decided before they were even born that his kids were going to be athletes. And one of them was a boy named Robert, whom Yaroslav trained mercilessly to become a great hockey player. So Robert, Bobby Holik, ultimately years later became an NHL star. Mm. So I reached out to Bobby Holik as I decided, really, this is a book I want to do.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find a way of getting in touch with him. So, I mean, electronic means, but I did find a mailing address for him. So I mailed Bobby a letter.
Where was this?
And he was living in Wyoming.
Okay.
And I mailed Bobby a letter, and I figured, okay, I'm never going to hear from him. And 2 weeks later, I get a phone call and says, "This is Bobby Holik. I love your project. I want to talk to you." And so we get on the phone and we have this amazing conversation. And at first he's kind of like, because Bobby cares deeply about this story. And one of the really key parts of the story where I really got him. So you asked about this before we got on video, but I'm wearing this t-shirt right here. And so this right here was this is a replica sort of the jersey that the Czechoslovak players wore. And this is something, these jerseys, these shirts are sold in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And so I bought this in Prague. And there's a little black mark right here. And so on the top of these jerseys, this is the coat of arms for Czechoslovakia. And there's a communist star right in the middle of the jersey. And Yaroslav Holik, the wild man, had led his teammates in putting black tape over the communist star before they played the Soviets.
Nice.
It was like, you communists are dead to us. And so I was talking to Bobby Holik, and he said, "Well, do you know about the tape?" And I immediately said, "Oh yeah, well, your dad led the team in taping over the stars." That was it for Bobby. Bobby knew, okay, this guy knows this story. So he said, "Okay, you got to come out here." So 5 days later, I was on a plane out to Wyoming. Bobby and I spent a couple days together just talking nonstop. And it happened to be, so this was late spring of 2017. It happened to be that I was going to go live in Europe for the 2017-18 year.
Okay.
And so I made a number of trips for a number of weeks off to the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And so some people I interviewed there in English if they spoke. So for example, Dominik Hasek, the great Czech goalie, some people say is the greatest goalie in world history. I interviewed him in English just outside of Prague, but a number of people I couldn't. And so I got translators there and had a wonderful translator, young American woman named Christina Slezacek there, who was my interpreter for anybody I was interviewing there. But then I had this amazing, this guy I worked with here. He's a PhD in political science. He's Czech. He's a hockey fan. And he translated everything for me. His name is Pavel Bachovsky, and he's a visiting professor of political science at Bates College. And he's this brilliant guy. And so I got a lot of this stuff. I mean, most of the stuff I worked with was in Czech. And so it was, in some cases, me interviewing people. In some cases, it was Pavel finding, documents and translating them for me.
Oh, wow. That sounds like it was a lot of fun as a
researcher.
Of fun. Yeah.
It was terrifying
not easy
at first. It was hard, but it was also, am I going to be able to get what I need? And I used to, when I interviewed politicians in Japan, I spoke Japanese. I think I've probably forgotten all of it. I don't like working this way. Like you want to work in the language, but
All right.
I'd take anything I could get. It was really thrilling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So back to the tournament. What pressure they must have felt going into that, or did they feel pressure? Or were they just so excited about this opportunity? What was the attitude like? Was there a Newt Rockney speech? Did they even need a speech? Like what was the situation that day of the first game?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, they didn't need the speech, but something that happened that was really cool was, I mean, they all sat there saying over and over, we need to do this for our people. And actually, the star of the team was a guy I also interviewed. He actually, what really cool thing, he was the best player on the team, a guy named Jan Suchi, had grown up with the Holiks in the same small town. And I mean, just tiny world, right? And he told me, you know, I just sat there going over and over again, this means so much to our people. This is for our people. I hope we do them right. And so they definitely felt that kind of pressure. But there was also one of the coaches of the team. And this is a wild case. He was a guy, he wasn't really a coach. He was a hockey professor. So this is the thing in communist countries. They have people who are just focused on like theory of sports. And so he was a theory of hockey guy. And he was kind of known as a robot. But right before the big first match, he turns to the players on the team and says, and he totally shocked them with this, because he was a diehard communist. He said, just remember that each and every one of us has made a solemn promise to do this for our country. And the players ate that up.
Yeah.
And then they skated out to the ice and got these incredible cheers from the Swedish crowd, which was totally supporting them, jeering the Soviets. And then they see these signs like, you send tanks, we bring goals. So yes, they felt nervous, but just so pumped up.
Yeah, what an atmosphere. All right, so what happened in the first time they played?
So it's this incredible match. And the Czechoslovak players, they knew they weren't allowed to get into a fight, but they hit the Soviets as in a way that was unusual for international hockey at the time. International hockey was not very rough, and the Czechoslovak players were playing very roughly. And the score was tied at 0 midway through the second period, and the guy I just talked about, Jan Suchi, the best player on the team, scores a goal for Czechoslovakia to make it 1-0. And right as he scores the goal, first of all, the crowd goes completely insane. But then I've watched this. You can watch game 1 on video, by the way. It's on YouTube. And there's this moment. I had to watch it multiple times and slow it down to 100% appreciate what was going on. The goal scores, and a star player for Czechoslovakia goes over to the right side of the net and lifts the net off the ice. On the left side of the net, then Yaroslav, really the central player in the story, takes his hockey stick. Now remember, this guy was totally crude. He used the horrible language all the time. He was always cursing people out. He was just wild. He takes his hockey stick and shakes it an inch away from the Soviet goalie's face, screaming, you bleeping commie. Then he takes his stick and smashes it down on the net multiple times and takes the rest of the net and throws it all the way over to the boards that were separating the fans from the ice. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. And so ultimately Czechoslovakia wins this first match 2-0. And a couple wild things happen at the end. One is the Czechoslovak players had planned in advance that you're supposed to, at the end of international ice hockey matches. I mean, we see this in Little League all the time. You're supposed to shake hands. You go in a line and everybody shakes hands. And the Czechoslovak players say, we're not shaking hands with these guys. And they skate off the ice as fast as they can, which is a huge breach of international hockey protocol. But the other thing is, as time is expiring, the Swedish crowd starts chanting. I mean, this is 8,000 people there in this first game. The crowd, again, Swedish, starts chanting the name of Czechoslovakia's leader, Dubček. So over and over again, Dubček, Dubček, Dubček. Yeah, just an electric atmosphere.
Wow. Did the players like have any sense that they shouldn't win? Like, did they fear any repercussions for themselves or their families? No. So
they definitely didn't fear any
yeah.
sort of, no.
Okay.
They certainly weren't thinking about that kind of thing.
Yeah. All right. But they do it once, and then they know they're gonna have to play again. What happens the second time?
So the second time, they are, part of the thing is the first match, everybody knew the Soviets had been sort of psyched out in the first one, that they had been, they hadn't been ready for just how angry the Czechoslovak players were and how angry the Swedish crowd was. That really shocked the Soviet players. That just, that never happens. But everybody knew the Soviets would be ready for game two. And this is where the Czechoslovak player said, not shaking hands with them, that's not enough. We need to do more. And that's where Yaroslav and a group of the players, taped over the star. And there was some of the players weren't aware that was going on, but there was one player who originally taped over the star, and then he got worried that he could ultimately be punished for doing that. In fact, this is a kind of thing people could get punished. This was written into law. You couldn't deface the coat of arms or anything like that. So you could go to prison for this, theoretically. And so one guy had the tape on, and then he decided to remove it at the last second because he was so scared.
Yeah.
But certainly not Yaroslav Holik, who just embraced all of this.
Yeah.
And match number two was, it was more intense than the first one, actually. There were more people. It was a completely capacity crowd. People were cheering again wildly for Czechoslovakia, but the Soviets were also playing incredibly well in this game. And it was tied at 2-2 going into the third and final period. And Czechoslovakia ultimately scores 2 goals and wins the match 4-3. As yet again, the players, at the end of the second match, you had Czechoslovak journalists just crying in the stands. You had players, as they sang the national anthem, looking like they were about to break down sobbing because they were so proud of what they had done. And the crowd is again chanting Dubček, Dubček over and over again.
Wow. And what's the reaction back in Prague and in Czechoslovakia?
Well, this is one of these things where, you don't see all that often a sporting event changing a country. This is a case where it actually did. So back home, at first, 500,000 people. Again, this country only is about 14 or so million people, but 500,000 of them take to the streets immediately following the second match to celebrate. And there was I spoke to this one woman, just kind of give you a sense of what a big deal this whole thing was. I interviewed this woman in Prague, and she learned I was writing on hockey. And she said, "I'm so sorry, I don't know anything about hockey." And I said, "Oh, that's okay. Just tell me about your life. Can you tell me about 1969? And she said, "Oh, 1969, that's when our boys fought the Soviets in hockey. I watched those matches, and I went out into the streets afterwards, even though I was 8.5 months pregnant."
Okay.
So she goes out into the streets with 500,000 other people who are celebrating. They're holding up signs that say the scores, but they also, are showing how political this was. So the leader of the Soviet Union that ordered the invasion was Leonid Brezhnev. And so there were people holding up signs that said Dubček 4, Brezhnev 3, so you had that sort of thing. But after a little while, the joy disappeared and it turned to fury. And so in any town in which, at this point, there were still 70,000 Soviet troops on Czechoslovakian soil, and any place that was housing Soviet troops, people went and sort of attacked the barracks. They started throwing bricks, flaming torches, all that sort of thing. In Prague, you had thousands of people go and attack the Soviet airline office and just completely destroy the place. And so this became known as the hockey riots. And because of the hockey riots, the Soviet Union basically said, aha, this is the excuse we're really looking for, because up until that point, there had not been 100% crackdown on Czechoslovakia's government. They'd sort of allowed a little bit of freedom still in Czechoslovakia. But after this, the Soviets came in and said, okay, Czechoslovakia, you actually need to be way harsher. And first, we're going to fire this. Dubček had remained in power up until this point. They get Dubček kicked out of office, and they force a total crackdown on Czechoslovakia's population, where everything just becomes so much more repressive.
So in a way, they won the battle and lost the war?
At that point, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, they definitely lost that part of the war.
Okay. Were you able to speak with any of the Soviet players, or
I didn't
get a
speak
sense
to
of
any
like what this
Soviet
tournament
players.
meant to them,
I read a few things about it, and I mean, there were a few things that were really interesting. I mean, one is in game one, I saw on the video, I saw a player. He had unfortunately passed away by this point, but it was a Soviet player who'd watched the Czechoslovak players skate off without shaking hands. And he was flipping his hand underneath his chin as if to say, screw you, Czechoslovakia. Well, it ended up he was one of the few Soviet players who was noted for being really sympathetic to Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
And so I asked some of the Czechoslovak players, do you know what was going on there? And they said, we know about that. We weren't sure, but we think he was just mad over our behavior. But other Soviet players, I've read accounts of other Soviet players talking about, look, we didn't hate the Czechoslovak players. We understood what was going on with them, and we just understood these hockey matches were about much more than just a sporting event.
Yeah. Okay. And speaking of much more, we talked about the previous title you'd been considering, but you have a really interesting story on how you arrived at the title Freedom to Win.
Yeah, I mean, this one was really cool. So I got to speak to Martina Navratilova. So Martina was born in Czechoslovakia, and she ultimately became the world's greatest tennis player. She defected to the US in the sort of mid-ish 1970s. But before that, when she was a kid, she saw Soviet tanks in her streets. As a brave little girl, she threw rocks and an apple at a Soviet tank. And she, along with her family, watched these hockey matches on their little black and white TV, jumping up and down. And I asked her about what did these hockey matches mean? And she said the hockey games went beyond sports. They gave people hope. They let us know that we still had the freedom to win. And I thought that was a really cool line at the time. And then it took me 3 weeks, a month to realize, whoa, that's my title. That's awesome. That is such a great title. And recently, actually, somebody had highlighted on Twitter how she had, first suggested the words and freedom to win, and I commented, yeah, she had given me the title in my interview, and then she popped up on Twitter and said, I didn't know I gave you the title. That's great.
All right. So at the outset you mentioned the parallels to what's happening in Ukraine now. So I mean, if you look at these two hockey victories, I mean, they were certainly inspirational, had affected actual change in the country for better and for worse. It sounds like at the time, eventually things changed. Czechoslovakia. I mean, what sort of inspiration or lesson is there potentially, in today's world, especially, for if this is translated into Ukrainian, like what can people take from this who are living in authoritarian countries or, under the threat of them?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things. I mean, just on one level, there's the fact that, I mean, this really is about, small. I mean, it starts off with small town boys, small town people, and then living in a small country. And it's really remarkable what sports mean when you're from a small town. Like, you're so used to everybody just kind of overlooking you. And Czechoslovakia had been constantly overlooked. And it was actually through success in these hockey matches that they felt that the world had to, recognize that they exist and that they even matter. And so that, again, comes back to what we talked about early on about the huge importance of inspiration in life. I mean, there's so many times where we are just, things are horrible. I think about, a year or so ago when, there were terrible school shootings. And I just remember getting up in the morning going, oh, and it's on days like that that, finding things to be inspired about that's what's required to get you out of bed. And so in Czechoslovakia, these hockey matches really allowed people to have a sense of, look, this is really hard right now, but we still have ways of fighting back. We still have ways of feeling like we matter, and we can get ourselves out of bed in the morning. And so it's, what I think about with places like Ukraine is, I don't know what gets people up and, out of bed in the morning, but you have to find those things when you're going through these tough times. So that's what this story ultimately, I think, really is about for when you're thinking about when times are toughest, what is it that's going to get you up and out of bed and able to push forward?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So just a few minutes left here, but has this experience of researching and writing and talking about this book changed the way you feel about the value of sports as a worthy academic subject? And like, if so, like, what will you do with that knowledge?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, because I mean, I'm sure I could come up with a way of doing, kind of classic hypothesis testing theories and all that kind of thing with sports. And I certainly could do that. I don't think I want to do that kind of thing. What I actually found with this was, I actually found it particularly wonderful as to be a teacher with this kind of stuff.
Okay.
That I have found that teaching this sort of thing with my students, really, again, coming back to inspiration, it gives them much more of a sense of, look, sports aren't necessarily just sports. There are times when they mean something so much more. And that in itself provides inspiration to students, and really gets them much more interested. One of the great things about my politics and sports class is that I admit this to my students periodically, is kind of the goal of the class is to use sports to trick them into caring about what went on in the Cold War.
Right.
And so, yeah, at its core, I think, sports are so important in so many important ways, and that this really makes it much more accessible to, young people who may otherwise not care so much about the quote unquote real world stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% in agreement with you there. And I was thinking of that word accessible, your whole answer, it's my philosophy with my books on racism or homophobia or anti-Semitism or feminism. It's all about using sports as an accessible platform to approach these topics. And I felt the same way reading your book, which, by the way, is just fantastic narrative nonfiction too.
Thank you.
Exactly the type of book that I love to read, and so I'd highly recommend it to everybody to read this book. Congratulations on writing a great book, and thanks for joining us. I hope you get to Nashville sometime. You got to come see a Nashville Predators game.
I do too, and who knows? Casey's applying to Vanderbilt, so you never know. I may find my way out there. But thank you so much for having me on. This is really fun.
Oh, absolutely. Just too quick. So, Casey, being the budding sports media, I don't know if he's still into that, but if he is, he needs to apply for the Grantland Rice sports writing scholarship here at Vanderbilt.
Sadly, his sports writing his sports writing came to an end. Unfortunately, he's now the extemporaneous speech guy. But
all right.
but yeah, no, the Rice scholarship would have been perfect.
Yeah. Well, if you come visit Nashville, let me know.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
All right. Take care.